I'm excited to be here and talking about this important topic with this great panel. Set the scene a little bit. I would say, in my experience, increasingly, I would say that the conversation around AI is shifting from just being a question of should we use AI at all, or what should we use it for, and increasingly moving towards how do we actually, you know, develop and deploy AI effectively and safely. And so that's something you're seeing increasingly. And I think you'll find the rest of this conversation very useful on those more practical safety, responsible AI kind of implementation issues. As with most things in business, it's about the balance, treading that fine line between leveraging these benefits of AI that we all know are so great and so potential, but in a responsible way that mitigates the risk with care. So that is finding that balance is the topic of today's discussion, and I'm lucky to have a great set of panelists who have very relevant experience in this topic in this industry in HR to discuss with today. So I'll let the panelists introduce themselves now. In order of my screen, do you want to go first, Bill, and then Carrie, and then Sultan, if you please?
Sure, absolutely. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bill O'Connor. I'm Assistant General Counsel and Director of Privacy and Regulatory Compliance at iCIMS, which is a talent acquisition software platform. So I lead the privacy program and the regulatory compliance program at iCIMS, and have been very involved in developing our responsible AI program over the last 5 years or so.
Great. So, Carrie, I think you're on mute. Had to be one. Had to happen.
Technology gets you every time. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carrie Miller. I am head of AI governance and research at Center for Inclusive Change. My research focus is on HR technology and AI procurement, and I'm really glad to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks for having us, Jeff. I'm Sultan. I'm co-founder of Beamery. We're an AI company helping a lot of the world's biggest organizations make talent decisions, from workforce planning to hiring and such, and been in the AI space for over a decade now. So it's been exciting to see the many chapters, and excited for this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you all for that. And finally, I'm Jeff Pohl, co-founder and CEO of Warden AI. My background before that was in developing AI products in the regulation technology domain, which gave me exposure to a number of the issues that we'll be talking about today. And briefly on the company, Warden AI is a third-party AI assurance platform for HR tech. And we help both platforms and employers measure and mitigate AI risks like bias and compliance, and ultimately demonstrate trust to the end users and stakeholders of the system. And the relevance there is that striking this balance between sort of risk and reward of AI through responsible AI has been intrinsic to the work we do and the ethos we have. And that's why we're excited to bring this discussion together today. So let's dig in. We'll first be talking about the rewards, then about the risks, and then about this kind of balance and how to kind of overcome and mitigate. There should be time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to share any questions in the chat feature as we go. We've also had some questions sent over beforehand, and we'll try to get to them at the end, time permitting. So to talk a bit about what's going on in AI and some of the benefits, perhaps Sultan, you can kick us off as a technology founder in this sector. Can you give us an overview of some of the real use cases of AI being used in HR and what impact that's actually delivering beyond just the hype that we all hear about at the conferences? What are you actually seeing on the ground that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that could probably take more than an hour to answer if we're going to dig into it. But I would say at a high level, very high level, there are two very distinct categories of use cases. One being how AI is being used to augment or automate existing work, and the other being how AI is used to provide insights or data, usually that didn't previously exist. And the two interact with each other, but they're very different. So the first one, I think, is the sort of more obvious if you sort of put your consumer hat on. Augment or automate, co-pilots, agents, who's using them, where does it apply? And the reality for a lot of the sort of augment and automate is that there's a difference between how it can be used, which is every part of existing experiences. Anything that somebody can do can be sort of carved into automation, augmentation, versus where is it actually a benefit? And like, how do you think about this being beneficial? In some cases, where is the benefit also outweighed by the risk? Take something simple. One of the first things that OpenAI announced as a use case for OpenAI was job description writing. Possible benefit. But OpenAI has no idea about the jobs in your company, and it could be biased. And should that really be how you replace your existing job descriptions, even if it's a little bit easier? Is it more risky than it's beneficial, and so on? Now, in practice, I think the boundary of whether this stuff is beneficial in either augmentation or automation depends on what is the role that people play in the end-to-end process versus just the role of AI, right? There's a lot of talk about how the role of engineers is moving towards being good reviewers rather than writers of code. Same with like lawyers and other professions. And this kind of takes me to the crux of the question, which is, I think when you look at HR and TA specifically, the benefits of being a steward of where these advantages come in the business, rather than just looking at how do I, as an HR or TA person, benefit from automation augmentation, is quite important, because someone in the business should be guiding, hey, we've taken these tasks away, they're now an agent. What is everyone else doing? That's a function that HR teams are leaning into to helping decide and define. And of course, there are benefits of HR and TA and others are using copilots and these other things increasingly. But there's a bigger question, which is, what's the insight? Which is the sort of second category of how do you know these things are having an impact? How do you put humans either first or at least not last in sort of the thinking around kind of the change? So that would be how I'd look at it. Use the insights and don't just think about the efficiencies. Think about the sort of the impact people can have and what role people play.
And that's really interesting, opening up not just sort of the impact of AI on specific HR, TA type processes, but what's the ramification on the people as a function when AI is maybe taking away some of those responsibilities or tasks. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, anyone else got any thoughts or want to chime in on where they're seeing impact in this sector from AI? Carrie, maybe you could go on.
Yeah, for sure. So there's 2 or 3 categories of things happening, and from my vantage point. There is a low-hanging fruit level. So we are all doing this stuff. We're all kind of sneaking over to ChatGPT and be like, can you please help me write this email, draft this policy? Like, I'm brain dead right now. I just need some help. And so that's absolutely happening for HR, just like it's happening for everybody else. We are doing that. Emails, draft policies, engagement surveys, learning recommendations, job descriptions. A really genius one that I like is taking 2 pieces of compliance regulation and comparing it to figure out like what are the differences, where's the gap, like what do I need to figure out how to do X, Y, or Z. Like those are really helpful things that could take hours to do on your own, but GPTs can do it quickly. So that's the low-hanging fruit level. And then there's a piloting level that is the vendors knocking on your door, kind of at the back door. Hey, like almost like with the watches, like, oh, look at my wares, and they're dangling these cool things, and you might not be able to ask good questions, and you get a little swept up in the some of the marketing speak. And so that adoption is taking place to a certain extent. And then there is a more organizationally deliberate approach where you've identified a use case, you understand that you want AI to help you solve it, and you more forcefully, kind of intentionally go after those things. And that's a spectrum. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in between all of that, but that's kind of what I'm seeing. And then of course within that, vendors run the spectrum of being like you guys are very diligent about being responsible, making sure your data is well received and well done and robust. And then there are vendors that are like, I don't know, I got it from, Hugging Face and it seemed good. And, so there's a literacy issue I hope we get to talk about as we go through here a little bit too.
Yeah, like brilliant. Yeah, I like that framework of the low hanging fruit down to more clear-cut use cases that actually drive value. I guess just to follow up on this, kind of open for anyone to answer. And what is, so lots of different use cases, different ways we, seeing HR people use AI, whether it's just from, simple thing like going ChatGPT, or using a vendor, or internally building something. What are the, like, what's the actual impact we're getting out of that? Like, I spoke by way of a potential example. I was speaking to a vendor recently who was, saying, almost bragging, I suppose, that like they're really, they're at the front line of this, and they're seeing that the teams they work with are laying staff off because their tool's so good, sort of thing. Is that materially happening, do you think? Is that a partial impact here, or what is the impact in your eyes? Bill, do you want to use your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't really have thoughts on whether it's people are being laid off because of the technology, but I will say, like, it's definitely helping like response times on support tickets and things like that, because you can automate the easy low-hanging fruit type of questions that without having to involve a human to do that stuff, especially standard questions that you receive all the time. So to me, that's one use case that's, low risk and definitely helping with an efficiency, both from a vendor perspective, but it's also a benefit to the customer because they're getting their issues resolved much quicker.
Right. Yeah, that's a good clear-cut use case. Sorry, go on, Sultan.
I think this comes down to time, right? Whether it's with AI now or just any of the sort of industrial revolutions, when you sort of zoom out over the span of a century, more employment, everything seems rosy. When you zoom in over the course of the people going through change, it's not always positive for everyone, right? So if you take an example like people doing customer support, it's actually an interesting thing we've seen with a lot of the customers we work with. The immediate reaction would be, well, either we just do more support, and actually there's been some companies that have said, yeah, we're actually going to double down, be more human, just support becomes better. Other companies are going to be more cost conscious and say, yeah, this is an opportunity to reduce the number of people. And the next question becomes, do those people go elsewhere and do another job? And how do you make a conscious decision about that? Support is an interesting one, because some of the hard to fill roles that companies going all in on AI have been things like content labeling. And actually, we've seen a lot of companies who've been thoughtful about it redeploy and train people from support, which is reducing, into roles like content labeling. But that kind of goes back to what I touched on with HR has a role to play, and how do you avoid efficiencies lead to job losses. But it doesn't mean that, in the short term, that's always easy to do. And a lot of companies have basically taken the mindset of AI is particularly impactful on junior roles. How do we become a pyramid or a diamond organization rather than a pyramid, and so forth? I think it's important to not think about it purely in efficiencies as you do that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I don't want to derail the conversation into like the job loss, societal impact thing, right? Where that's a bit probably outside our scope. But yeah, but I guess at least we know there's definitely a lot of reward out there. There's a lot of use cases that are maybe immature, or things people are trying out and are piloting, not working. But on the whole, we're seeing a lot of adoption. At least we are starting to see a lot of adoption of AI. Some great benefits from that, and that's only, I think, fair to say, it's only going to increase right from here as we work out where the most useful way to deploy AI is. So maybe with that behind us, now a good time to turn to talk about some of the risks with going down this path. So Bill, perhaps you can give us an overview of these risks, in particular the use of AI in the context of HR and talent. That'd be great.
Sure, be happy to. I think, at least for me, the things I see day to day, there's kind of three big buckets of the risks. The first one is bias and discrimination. We get questions about that all of the time. So ensuring that any decisions related to employment or hiring are bias-free as possible and comply with existing employment discrimination laws, regardless of whether technology is involved. There's been a lot of focus on this kind of in the early AI laws, for example, the New York City AEDT law, and it's being replicated in several of the new and proposed AI laws. The next big area, especially for me, since I lead the privacy program, is privacy and data protection. So the use of personal data, whether it's to train the algorithm or just in use of the algorithm itself or the AI functionality, kind of all of the associated issues that come with privacy and data protection. So the source of the data, whether you have permission to use the personal data for that purpose, the ability to effectuate privacy rights, so deletion requests, rectification, restrict processing, all of that kind of stuff is challenging with AI. And then the last big risk, I think, is just the transparency and explainability. This isn't really unique necessarily to HR and talent acquisition, but it's really important to be able to explain how a hiring decision or employment decision was made if AI was involved in making the decision. So being able to provide documentation to customers about, as a vendor, about how the functionality works and how the decisions are made, and the new laws are requiring a lot of documentation about explainability, for vendors to provide to their customers and for customers as deployers to be able to provide and explain to the consumers. So those are big areas that I deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Great. Thanks for that overview. Great. There's obviously so many other things we can talk about as well, but I think there's a good 3 core buckets that are probably
right.
pretty consistent. And I think probably some of the privacy and explainability, I imagine, are fairly cross-sectoral. I wonder if the bias one is more even more sensitive and more like of an important issue in HR. And is that something that's changed over time in the last year or two? You've seen, Bill, in terms of, in my experience, going back a couple of years, data privacy was like #1 issue, even with AI and outside. Interesting that you highlighted bias as the one that's the most common issue to you today. Is that a fair reflection of a change, or is that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because one of the first real AI laws that went into effect was the New York City law. So a lot of us had to deal with that. And that is primarily, going through a bias audit and being able to produce a bias report that you make available to customers and make publicly available. So, that, that one's pretty narrow in scope, and that it only is a couple of protected classes of information, but like that kind of the next iteration as the new laws come about is expanding the scope of that to all of the other protected classifications and doing your tests and audits on all of that stuff. So I think it's just growing from there, but those employment discrimination laws are not new. So it's the application of this technology to these existing laws and trying to make sure that you or your customers don't get tripped up by the existing laws related to employment and discrimination. And and we could debate this, but humans obviously are biased, and we know all of that, and there's lots of research about that, and whether the use of technology actually reduces the bias, because it's more consistent. And there's definitely research and evidence to potentially show that, but making people comfortable with that is kind of the hurdle that we're trying to get over. And so a more extensive and expansive bias audits, I think, will probably lead to the comfort that AI actually probably is, or maybe potentially is, less biased than human bias, but we'll see. It's definitely a challenge, and we get lots of questions from prospects and customers about that.
Yeah, that's super interesting comments. And yeah, definitely we're on an early stage of a journey, I think, as a society, almost, of like how much do we trust the technology that's new, and also to what standards do we uphold it to in comparison to the status quo of people powered processes, which we maybe turn a blind eye to quite often. And then to move, we touched a bit on regulation there. It'd be great to dig in a bit more on the AI regulation, which is obviously a huge topic. But my next question is of the many AI regulations that are happening around the world, which are the ones that people in this particular industry in HR should be aware of, whether they are on the developer or deployer side as an organization. Maybe Carrie, you can give us an overview of that to kick us off.
Yeah, well, the obvious big one is what's going on in the EU, in the EU AI Act. And the reason being is twofold. They have classified HR technologies as in their high risk category because it makes consequential decisions about individuals. So also education is in there, and housing is in there, and loans are in there. So these are important things to people, right? So that particular law requires a lot of scrutiny on debiasing to the best you can and reporting out on what you've done to mitigate these things. And so it's a burden on the deployers and the developers. It doesn't say you can't do that, do these types of software, but it does require a lot of effort to make them safe as possible. However, there is one area that it does eliminate, and that is biometric stuff. So anything you're going to do with like video interviews or text or text type of stuff. So you're just going to capture their voice and do a transcription of what they've said somewhere, or you're going to do, let's do a gaming assessment and see how you finish this game. Like that stuff is no more in Europe when this comes to light. Now, I bring this up, and I don't know how many we have here from the US versus Europe, but we tend to follow them as our leader a little bit, maybe not at the national level right now, but the states are looking at them saying, huh, that's interesting. And so we already have some biometric regulations. It's, oh gosh, I can't think of who the fingerprint state is that has already put a massive lawsuit out there on fingerprint clocking in. Does anybody, Sultan, you remember that?
I can't remember
lawsuit?
which state, Carrie. I was trying to.
Yeah, it was
Illinois
a
is
hamburger.
Illinois,
that's right.
Yeah, it's Illinois.
So those things are coming. And then the other side of it, Bill mentioned this, is the data privacy. So California already has data privacy, but they went one step further and they started protecting employment data. And I think that's also going to be the next trend. Colorado does some things with high risk systems, so employment systems are going to fall under them, and that will come to bear February 1 of next year. So, and there are 20 more state laws right in play right now that are in various states of, working their way through. So we need to pay close attention.
Right. There are lots of different ones. Keeping track is becoming harder, right? Exactly what's passed, what impact it means, which sector implicates what the impact is. So to summarize then, is it fair to say that in this taking this very sector specific approach in HR and TA, that the EU Act, of course, is a huge one to be aware of. There's a New York City law that Bill already mentioned that is already in effect, an important one. Colorado, it's coming next year, right? In February 2026. And to some extent the California one, but that's a bit less directly on, mitigating, regulating employment.
Texas
right?
is
it's more of a data fix.
Texas is very close too, which is like mind blowing. I don't know how they did that, but but let me tell you the theme. You're going to have to do an impact assessment. So get to understand how impact assessments work. School yourself up on impact assessments and get your auditors ready. Just start exploring. Talk to, what's an auditor? What's an AI auditor? What do they do? How does that work? Do I need one? What if my system did one? If they did one, do I have to do one? Start asking those questions, because those two things are in these bills: impact assessments and annual audits. Figure that out.
And you're speaking particularly for the deployer side of the equation, right? Where you have to do, if you're deploying an AI system, you have to do impact assessments.
And if the law doesn't require you to do it as a deployer, they require the developer to do it. And so as you evaluate which developers are going to be good ones to hire for your work, you want to be able to effectively evaluate that. Yeah, those are things those are the upskilling tips today.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Well, we're going to get probably a bit more specific on this as well coming up, on how to kind of overcome these challenges and these risks. But thanks for the overview of regulation. But I know there's a number of other ones as well, but any other key ones that we're missing here, just to make sure we haven't overlooked anything? Or are the others, something like New York and New Jersey and Illinois and so on, are following a similar pattern to New York City, but haven't passed yet? Feel free to jump in if we've missed anything key.
The only other thing I was going to add is some of them aren't really being billed as AI laws. Like California recently adopted some employment-related automated decision-making regulations, and so they're not tagged as AI laws, but when the definition of automated decision-making is very broad, and so AI may get pulled into that. So we need to pay attention to those as well.
Right. Got it. Thanks for sharing. Great. Okay, so we've heard a bit about some of the risks. Key ones are data privacy, bias, and external build transparency. At least let's pin those up as some of the key ones. We've got all those regulations coming. turning to, I guess, this point of balancing risks and kind of, not just stopping everything and not building AI or deploying AI. How do we do it in a responsible way that works? What are some of the best practices let's start with the vendors, right? Carol touched on this a little bit, but what are some of the best practices AI vendors can follow to maximize responsible AI development adoption? Maybe something you can kick us off on this one.
Before I actually jump into the specifics for a vendor, I think the first best practice is to consider who you're a vendor for and their own best practices, right? So, I mean, if you start with the HR question, there's obviously a bunch of AI specific regulations, but the New York, which in many ways kind of triggered the wave of AI perspectives in HR in the last couple of years, the New York regulations in many ways are about bias rather than AI specifically. And they're an extension of, the decades long approaches to things like disabilities and so forth and accommodations. And this is important because when you are building technologies, obviously you think about your users, but you also have to think about the organizations and the considerations they have. For example, will they need to be able to do their own auditing, or are you just doing your auditing? Is there going to have to be transparency around impact? Like bias is a complex word, and there's a lot of proof, to Bill's point, that technologies can reduce it, but it's very different in areas, to Carrie's point, where there are risks, like let's say in video interviewing, that are different to risks elsewhere that actually might be more transparency led and risk reducing, right? In the world of people decisions, there's been, forgetting AI for a second, like a lot of proof points around what creates objectivity, consistency, and then you sort of bring AI as a supporting function for that. So in short, I think whether it's in HR or otherwise, first best practice is consider both users and organizations and what they have to consider, which then sort of feeds, well, what is the development and adoption? And I think, there's certain things that have been touched on, like privacy, explainability, bias. I would say that the addition to that would be auditability. I think the question around not just auditability in terms of regulations, but actually also in terms of changes, right? Models change, approaches change. How do you know how these things are improving, not improving? We did a bunch of work years ago before all the regulations came in just to create external explainability statements, but also measures of this is how we're tracking improvements in models and so forth. And some of that is increasingly blending into what's actually regulatory, expectations. But I think the question of transparency isn't just explainable AI, it's also explainability where possible in terms of approach, outcomes, so forth. And as you know, Jeff, so we are BMO Warden customers. So you guys have done some amazing things for us and our customers in terms of making that continuous. Because before we used Warden, in terms of external audits, we did it every year or 6 months. It's now a live monthly feed of different audits, etc. And again, that's not a regulatory requirement, but at least yet. But it is, I think, a best practice in terms of like how frequently are you monitoring this stuff? What's changing? In terms of the adoption side, I think the kind of going back to what is the change, what's the user? In theory, if AI works really well, to use your example, Jeff, we probably will have fewer humans using it. And that's not necessarily the adoption you're looking for. And I think there's a boundary between, what are you trying to do? Forgetting whether you're trying to do social good or not, I think there has to be intentionality when you're building things around, are you trying to create new habits? AI generates a nudge so you don't have to think about things. Or are you trying to augment existing habits? You now spend less time searching, emailing, whatever it might be. And I think the intentionality of that is important, both in the safeguards you put in and in how you monitor, is this doing what we want? And, there are lots of more sophisticated practices for how companies do audits around this stuff in terms of user experience, like red teaming, etc. But even at the basics, intentionality and monitoring of this is what we're trying to do to behaviors and impact, and this is how we're monitoring it. It's easy for that stuff to get left by the wayside when you're just optimizing for, the basics.
Yeah. And I love that point about auditability, which, if I've understood it correctly, you're saying it's not just about like an external auditor. Maybe that's one thing that you do, but in terms of your system being able to be, and your changes and the way your processes work, that someone else, whether it's just a customer or any external stakeholder or body, can actually follow how that's done. How you do, move from development to production for a new AI system, what's involved in that, and being able to audit in terms of understand and see how that looks is important. I think it's an interesting angle to maybe not explainability, because that's more just about being able to see your processes, but it's all there's lots of different kind of angles to explainability, right? Explaining your processes, explaining how the AI itself actually works, and being transparent about all of those. So lots of good points to potentially impact more there. Any other thoughts? I want to chime in on this topic of vendor best practices before we move on.
The only other thing I would add in kind of the early stages, but I would say eventually certifications are going to probably become a best practice. ISO 42001, will be very soon. Questark has a responsible AI certification that iCIMS obtained not that long ago. So things like that, I think vendors will also be able to do to help build trust with their customers that they have been audited against standards and meet the standards. So I would, that is coming too. It's in the early stages right now.
And just a double click on that, I think it's very new in the AI space, but increasingly critical, because we've had that for so many other areas. To your point, I think it's now the norm and expectation. So whether you're a vendor or looking at vendors, I think that's going from new to expected very rapidly.
And which ones would you say are those? It's obviously a bit of an evolving picture, but what are those standards that you think are the most common ones, again, in the sector for vendors?
This 42001 and NIST AI RMF are the two dominant ones right now.
Yeah, I would agree. You can get a certification for ISO. You can't really get a certification for NIST, but it is definitely an accepted kind of global standard to follow.
There's a lot of overlap between the two.
Overlap, right?
Yep.
So people said about 80% overlap too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I come at this whole space from the buyer side of the equation. That's just my consulting business is buyer side. And so as I look at vendor best practices, I am always looking for the trust marks. I'm always looking that certification for ISO is huge for me, but I'm also looking on the website for, tell me what you did, especially when you have put in this effort for responsible AI. It is not inexpensive to do that work. It takes time, it takes money, it takes talent, and it takes knowledge. It's not easy work. And so when you do that I want to see blasted on the web. I just want to see lots of little vignette videos of you talking about it. I want to see little checklists that I can download. Like, I just want to feel it coming from you. Like, out of every pore, if you're doing that, because the reason is there are a lot of vendors who also are not doing that, who cannot make those claims, and who, if they do, they can't substantiate them. So I'm always on the lookout for trust marks. Yeah, I think those are best practices. If you're doing them, talk about them, please. Don't be shy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, get them. Get more trust marks. The more, the better. Get them on display. Helps buyers.
Definitely be able to uphold them. Don't
Right.
Don't come out with a bunch of marketing speak and make me try to figure it out on my own. Like, really do the do, please.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely want to have rigor behind these things. And I think what we're seeing in the market is that more and more, these standards are always starting points, right? Particularly for enterprise buyers. Just because you got a SOC 2 or ISO 2001 compliance certificate on the kind of more security side and data, it doesn't mean they're not going to dig in more than that just because you've got that. So I think that the AI space is going down a similar route where it's a starting point. And then there's still more procurement process that happens behind it. Maybe carry on there on that the buyer side then, and deployer side in the context of deploying the AI. What can deployers do to gain confidence that they're deploying an AI that is safe and compliant, and feel confident doing that, rather than just saying, oh, this is too scary and too risky, I'm not going to move forward with AI at all?
Yeah, this is such a great question, because it is, sometimes people bring in AI and then they just they have just this mental lapse, and I don't know why this is happening. AI requires the same change management efforts as every other IT system we have ever brought into our organization. This is not different. So what that means is you onboard it, you train people, you tell them its limitations, you provision it, who's allowed to use it, who's not allowed to use it, how they're allowed to use it, what data is allowed to go into it, what shouldn't be going into it. You monitor it, you check up on it, all the things. It should go straight up just like any other digital transformation change management. You have obligations to govern that just like you would. Just because it's AI doesn't make it any different in that regard. And I don't know why I'm seeing people not do that. It's really interesting. They're like, oh, it's auto magical. Look at it. Like, no, go back to our roots. Because otherwise you don't get the ROI off of it. Things are going to go haywire,
Right. Okay. So your argument is it should be a similar standard, maybe slightly different in practice, but in terms of the rigor of governance that's applied to other types of IT project and procurement and whatever and deployment. But you're not seeing as much of that at the moment. I guess
I don't know why.
to try and bridge that gap of like the ideal that you might be advocating for and not doing much at all, what are maybe some of the key steps or some of the key things, the most important things that are lower hanging fruit for deployers to do and make some progress here without necessarily going to the perfect level?
Yeah, minimally. There's one thing that with AI that's different from regular IT, and that is misuse or abuse of the system. Because if you are not using that system correctly, AI is they're like toddlers, right? You have to know what they're doing, where they're at, if they've eaten bad data, if they need a timeout because they're behaving bad. So if you have people that are feeding it, trade secrets and payment information and salary data, you're like, oh, probably shouldn't do that. You have to know that that's going on. They should have been told not to do that up front. And you'd certainly want to block it if you can, and you want to catch it if it's been done. So those are just minimal things. I see someone shaking his head. Yes. I mean, that at minimum, try not to misuse the system because it can be pretty disastrous from a liability perspective if you do.
I mean, that picks up on your AI literacy point, where it's like you need to understand the basics, right? Without diving into that maybe too much right now, you need to understand the basics of not only AI in terms of how it technically works, but in terms of what the system can and can't do. And there's a big emphasis on that, right? People think it's because it's a bit like general purpose intelligence in many cases, a bit like a person, it can do anything, and that's something almost seems that way, but you shouldn't use these systems for the wrong thing. Right?
One thing I'd add to that is I think a lot of organizations are aware that being overly cautious or slow in internally rolling out AI training and tools often means that people are just using external tools that are less safe. And so there's kind of a boundary between how do you navigate regulations versus how do you also navigate the inevitability that people are, the Pandora's box of people using stuff is open. So you actually want to at least have a centralization to how you do it.
Right. Absolutely key. So now picking up on the regulation again, going back to that a bit more, a number of the AI regulations that we've touched on are criticized for not being very well defined. Where they define high-level principles and activities that you should do something about, whether that's explainability or bias or whatever it is. It's like these are risks, do something. But some people criticize that they're not too prescriptive in how to actually what to do. So my question is, how can an organization, whether a developer or a deployer, who's trying to comply with the regulations, actually judge what practices to implement in order to be compliant? Appreciate it's a huge question. That could be a big topic, but is there a quick download on that, Bill, you can maybe share to help the audience who are probably going through this process themselves in some of the cases?
Sure, yeah. We've definitely been through this process. We went through it at iCIMS like 5 years ago when we started our responsible AI program because there wasn't really a lot of guidance out there to go on. But I'll start by just saying this. Doing something is better than doing nothing. So even if it's not clear on what exactly to do when it comes to kind of AI governance and compliance, educate yourself on what some of the potential options may be and pick one that makes sense for your business to at least get started. As is the case with many laws, the guidance and clarification often comes after the laws go into effect. So we often have to kind of iterate on our initial actions and adjust them once the requirements are clarified. Just a couple of examples of things we've done at iCIMS. Like I've mentioned, we've done the New York City bias audits. That law is pretty clear on what those requirements are, and the scope's pretty narrow. But now we're determining how do we expand the scope of our AI audits to address other requirements of other laws, whether that's, like I mentioned earlier, including additional protected classification data for bias calculations, that kind of thing, or including additional AI functionality to the scope of the audit. The other thing I would say is leverage existing processes. So at iCIMS, the privacy team was initially responsible for a lot of the AI governance. So we leveraged a lot of our existing privacy processes. So whether that's incorporating AI into existing processes, for example, risk assessments, adding AI related questions to risk assessments, that kind of thing, or modeling an existing process, like an AI related process after an existing privacy process. So for example, at iCIMS, we created an AI by design process that's very similar to our privacy by design process, but the questions are different in the AI by design assessment. So that's kind of at a high level how we tackled like addressing these things when it's not clear, is leverage existing practices and educate yourself on what potential options are and pick one that makes sense for your business to get started.
Right. I think it's quite interesting, almost dichotomy between the New York City law being possibly one of the first AI in the world, which is extremely prescriptive, right? It's very, very prescriptive, very narrow in many ways, also very flawed, depending on your point of view in other ways. But we won't get into that. It's still great that started the wave. And then it feels like the ones that are coming now that are more expansive are therefore much less prescriptive. They're the opposite, right? They're not really saying what to do at all, at least not yet. They're just saying do something around this concern. So that's really good advice. So you pick something, do something, even if it's not clear what it is. Don't do anything. Particularly if you can use existing or adapt existing processes, and then perhaps we'll expect more precise guidance to come once the regulations are actually rolled out next year for many of them, and then I guess we adapt our processes and refine them based on the clarification from the regulator. Great. Any other comments on that? Were you about to jump in there, Sultan?
No, just agreeing.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that the couple of things that we're looking at, there are at least 50 different kinds of impact assessments. I mean, there's human rights impact assessments, there's technical impact assessments. I mean, there's just all kinds of impact assessments. What my advice is, pay attention to the use case. It really, everything we do now has to be use case specific. So sometimes your use case doesn't need this, wild, full-blown. It could be a very small use case with, even though it fits into HR, which is technically a high risk category, it doesn't necessarily mean that specific use case is high risk. Now, resume ranking and kicking someone out of a system, because it might pick up proxy data about their lacrosse career in high school. Yeah, that's high risk. And so you might have to do some extra stuff, but like impact assessments are one where you've got a lot of options at your fingertips, all the way from 10 questions to 300 questions. I mean, there's a breadth here that we're dealing with. There's a maturity happening in this responsible AI space too. So I would look to the EU because the ICO and other organizations have published lots of different standards and templates and all kinds of things that can help you figure out how to do explainability statements. And just there's a lot of available resources out there right now. But yeah, and get a guide like any of us to help you.
One thing I'd add to that is I think when it comes to internal teams kind of aligning on how we're reviewing AI, this question of what is the use case is often missed up front, especially when people are evaluating software. To take your example of resume ranking, kind of 15 years ago, that was one of the first types of AI to go wrong in HR, because it was actually very simplistic AI that looked at keywords and then ends up being a risk. If you want a internal AI team to help review a technology, whether it's doing something at risk of upcoming regulation, like video interviewing, or something that may have been a problem before, like resume ranking, but might not be depending on your approach, like only focusing on control data, etc. The detail is important, because otherwise it's easy to take an approach that presupposes that certain things about use case and how the AI works, etc., that a legal team or an AI team isn't going to know, as well as the people who are trying to implement it and understand the use cases. So I'll just add that whether you're a vendor and thinking about how do you help explain it to your buyers, or a buyer trying to think about like, have we made it clear, that is a step that often is underappreciated.
Yep, that's so true. And I guess a lot of that detail and nuance in the use case, like you're saying, and the system is, I suppose, one of the reasons why a number of these regulations are a little bit open to interpretation, because it's very hard to give, could cover a wide range of sectors, use cases, and give prescription. You kind of like a breadth versus depth challenge. So that's a good explanation of that state. Excellent discussion. I'm conscious of time, so I want to wrap the panel up soon and allow time for a bit of questions. And see someone's got their hand up, so we'll come to that soon. Before we do, just to, I guess, wrap up on the panel side, what final advice would you leave our audience with on how to be responsible with AI in this HR industry? And maybe start with Bill. Do you want to go first in this one, and then go around?
Sure. Yeah, I would say, we touched on it a bit, but have a framework that you use to assess AI. So it really helps to have a consistent process that's based on known, recognized standards. So do your due diligence, ask lots of questions of your vendors, but also educate yourself. The more you know about how AI works, the more comfortable you'll be using it, and the more you'll be able to educate others and get them comfortable with using it.
Great advice. And Carrie?
Yeah, I would say, adding to Bill, have your framework, have a process. Absolutely, it's a team sport. So I would use a deliberate cross-functional team. They don't have to be full-time, just, it's an extra job for them. So give them a bonus. But between that, they should be assessing whatever's inbound, what's knocking on your front door or your back door. And then the second thing I would say is capture all your incidents. Capture all your incidents. For better or for worse, some you'll be able to resolve, some you won't be able to resolve. It's the nature of the game right now, but keep track of them, because they'll be important to you at some point.
I couldn't agree more. The only thing I'd add, and again, this is a question that in theory could go into a lot of detail, but I'd add, consider the external validation that you can get, not just from auditors, but also, to Carrie's point earlier, if you put yourself out there, this is our approach, this is what we're doing as a company. And similarly, if you open up the right feedback windows for users or buyers, you can create a program of continuously leveling up, right? I think people who develop AI are familiar with AI can improve itself, as a feed on what people click. The same applies to responsible AI, right? It's one thing to stay ahead of regulation. It's another thing to make sure that there is an effective feedback loop from your customers, from your partners, technology providers, etc. And that can go a long way if you embed that in your programs.
Brilliant. Great advice. So we have a framework, do your due diligence, have a cross-functional team to analyze these things, track incidents, and be transparent with what you do and potentially seek external validation. Just a few things to take away and do to be responsible. But great, thank you. Great panel, great discussion. We have no question chat, but we have a raised hand, so I'm going to allow Barry Phillips to talk. Hi, Barry. Are you with us?
Hello, Jeff, and hello to the panel. Really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if this is a question, but possibly more of a comment or an observation. I work in legal compliance in the UK and Ireland, and we work very closely with a large number of HR people. And what is coming back quite strongly, particularly from those in the public sector, is the utter confusion in terms of working with Gen AI and in particular ChatGPT. We've asked quite a few in HR in the public sector do you use ChatGPT, for example? And they'll say, oh no, it's banned. You ask them how they know it's banned, and they say because they can't access it through the browser. If you say to them, well, is there any memo or any directive that's come from above in terms of this? They just say, not as far as we are aware. What they will also say to you is, but they know that employees are using it because they're using it on their handheld devices, etc. So you've got that big issue of the dark use of Gen AI. So I guess my question is, I'm very curious, if that's the situation in the US, but I just wonder if the panel ever sees a point, bearing in mind just how fast AI is developing, that ChatGPT and yes, other Gen AI models will be trusted enough so that employers, even those in the public sector, will be able to say, yes, it is safe enough to use for most common use cases. Sorry, it's a lot, but there we are.
I think it boils down to a good question. Will employers, particularly public sector, ever trust Gen AI tools like ChatGPT to be rolled out in their organization? Carrie's shaking her head vigorously.
No.
No, not gonna happen.
No.
Anyway,
No, I mean, it requires literacy. We didn't get to talk too much about literacy. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone got a contrarian perspective on that?
I mean, I think it depends on what we think of as ChatGPT, right? Because there are ways in which this stuff is being rolled out through APIs with more control than just sort of a public consumer ChatGPT tool. And I do think that, in fact, some of the fastest adoption of Gen AI actually happened in the defense sector early on. It's just in a private environment with, more control. So agree with Carrie on not the consumer version, but I do think there's non-consumer versions that will.
It also depends on your definition of trust.
Right.
Within reason.
Yeah, personally, I would be surprised if we fast forward 5-10 years, if large language model, Gen AI based systems are not heavily used throughout all large organizations because the economic benefits are too overpowering. You kind of can't, in a capitalist society, it's hard not for that to happen. So I think in a macro sense, yes, but maybe not just saying, yeah, here's ChatGPT, go and log in to that and just do whatever you want. That's not going to happen. I think that's the conclusion. Thanks for the question. Good question. And then we had another one from before the kind of offline, which is quite a specific question, going back to detail. What are the specific granular differences between the EU AI Act high-risk obligations that fall on deployers, e.g. the employer, versus the provider, e.g. a Workday or whoever? So yeah, we know this regulation's huge, so that's a lot of things. Someone want to maybe, Bill, do you want to jump in with a summary of the differences between deployers and providers in the EU Act?
Sure. I'll start by saying there's a lot of kind of cheat sheets and charts and stuff out there on the internet for this. So for example, the IAPP has like a matrix document that you can go look at that kind of sums it up very quickly, what the difference between the deployer and provider requirements. But there's a lot more requirements on providers, at least for high risk AI. So providers have to put in place risk management systems, data governance, training, validation, testing data sets, technical documentation, record keeping requirements, including automated logging and specific record retention periods, transparency, providing information to customers and consumers, human oversight, accuracy, robustness, cybersecurity requirements, quality management systems, conformity assessments, registration requirements with authorities, corrective actions. So like if a system isn't functioning correctly, potentially even disabling it, cooperation with authorities. So providing information to authorities about the AI systems, appointing authorized representatives. There's requirements related to CE markings and accessibility and display criteria for certain types of AI, post-market monitoring systems, And also reporting of serious incidents to authorities. Like that's kind of the laundry list of what's required of providers. Deployers, it's a much shorter list. They have the transparency and providing information requirements. And they also have requirements to document technical and organizational measures. There's human oversight requirements. They have similar corrective action requirements. The impact assessments, like Terry mentioned earlier, fundamental rights impact assessment, including notifying authorities of the results. And there are registration requirements on deployers also, but a much shorter list for deployers than providers.
And I think that in the deployer column, as they purchase these systems, they also have to, part of their risk management plan, they have to validate that the provider actually did all the things that is in the provider column. So they have to understand the provider's obligations and verify that those happen. So it's not like they're even, I mean, it's just, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot for sure.
Yeah, that was a really good question for whoever asked it, and a very dense answer. Great for covering so much so quickly. Because there's a lot in this regulation, and why that Carrie, you mentioned earlier, EU Act might become even in the US, quite a standard of, or a high standard of quality, AI, responsible AI governance practices for the reason there's so many practices. So brilliant. I think that's all we have time for, sadly. Conscious of time, and so we'll wrap it up there. To all the panelists, Carrie, Bill, Sultan, thanks so much for speaking today and making this insightful session. And thank you to everyone who attended for joining us. This is the first in a series of webinars that Warden is running on a similar theme. So keep an eye out for future events that we'll be running. And I think that's it. So have a good rest of your day, everyone.